The Missouri Bootheel has some of the richest soil on the North American continent. The land sits atop the Mississippi embayment, a geological depression filled over millions of years with sediment carried by the Mississippi and its tributaries, deposited in layers up to 300 feet deep in some places. It is flat in a way that is almost disorienting if you've spent any time in the Ozarks to the north, flat and dark and featureless in the way that only truly ancient flood deposit land can be. The kind of flat that tells you something enormous happened here a long time ago and left behind the most productive agricultural terrain in the interior of the continent. Soy, cotton, rice, corn, wheat. The Bootheel counties of Dunklin, New Madrid, and Pemiscot generate nearly a third of Missouri's entire agricultural income on a fraction of the state's land. What the ground here produces per acre in good years rivals the yields of the great corn and soybean belts to the north, and the people who live in the Bootheel, the people who have always lived in the Bootheel, are among the poorest in Missouri. Pemiscot County, which sits along the Mississippi at the southernmost tip of the state, has been one of the poorest counties in Missouri for most of the last century. New Madrid County, Dunklin County, the counties of the Bootheel consistently rank at or near the bottom of every measure of economic health in the state. Income, employment, health outcomes, educational attainment. They sit on land that generates billions of dollars in agricultural output and returns almost none of that value to the communities that grow it. The Farm Security Administration surveyed the Bootheel during the Great Depression and described what they found in 4 words: a paradox of rich land and poor people. Those 4 words were accurate in 1935. They are accurate today. The soil has not changed. The yields have increased. The paradox has not resolved. What has changed in each generation is the specific mechanism by which the wealth produced by that soil leaves the region. The actors change. The arrangement stays the same. That arrangement did not begin with the current wave of corporate agricultural consolidation. It has been in place in different forms for over 100 years. To understand what is happening to the Bootheel today requires starting at the beginning, which is not in a boardroom in New York or a trading floor in Chicago. It is in a drainage ditch in 1905. Before 1900, most of the Bootheel was swamp. The land that now produces billions of dollars in crops every year was, within living memory of people born in the early 20th century, a vast wetland of cypress forests, backwater, and bottomland that nobody had found a practical way to farm at scale. The Mississippi embayment terrain held water. The rivers flooded it seasonally. The ancient flood deposits that made the soil so extraordinarily rich also made the ground functionally unusable for cultivation without massive engineering intervention. Then the engineers arrived. In 1905, the Little River Drainage District was organized, a project that would, over the following decades, build an elaborate network of ditches, canals, and levees to drain the swamps and convert the wetlands into cropland. It was one of the largest drainage projects in American history, eventually transforming hundreds of thousands of acres of standing water and cypress bottomland into some of the most productive agricultural terrain in the country. By the time the work was substantially complete, the Bootheel had been physically remade. What had been a wilderness became a farm. From 1880 to 1930, as the drainage work proceeded and the converted land became available, the population of the region more than tripled. But the people flooding in were not all settlers in the traditional sense, family farmers acquiring homesteads. Outside investors, developers, and insurance companies with capital moved in ahead of the population wave, buying up the newly drained acreage at scale before the local residents had any mechanism to compete with institutional buyers. The pattern was established before the first crop was planted. Outside money came in, bought the land, and the people who arrived after worked it for wages or shares. Insurance companies that had invested in the drainage projects became some of the largest landholders in the region. Cotton planters, who had been farming in Arkansas and the Mississippi Delta, recognized the potential of the newly drained Bootheel soil and moved north, purchasing or leasing from the institutional landholders and replicating the plantation structure of the Deep South in Missouri. With them came thousands of black sharecroppers recruited as labor, families whose economic relationship to the land they worked was identical to the sharecropper relationship that had defined the post-Civil War Deep South. The cotton economy that followed was built on the same foundation. After the boll weevil devastated cotton crops across Arkansas in the early 20th century, planters from the South moved north into the newly drained Bootheel, purchased or leased land from the insurance companies and institutional investors who held it, and brought thousands of black sharecroppers north with them. The sharecropper model placed families on land they did not own, guaranteed them no wages, allowed them to be evicted at the landlord's discretion, and held them in a cycle of debt through company stores and credit arrangements that left almost no path to land ownership. By 1935, 3/4 of all farms in the Bootheel were operated by tenants rather than owners. Most of those tenants were black. The land was controlled by a small number of absentee or semi-absentee landowners who extracted the value of what the extraordinarily productive Bootheel soil produced while the people growing it remained in poverty. The cotton economy did not create the poverty paradox. It inherited the land ownership structure that the drainage period had established and added the sharecropper labor arrangement on top of it. The result was a region where the gap between what the land produced and what its workers received was not incidental. It was the entire business model. When the Great Depression hit and cotton prices collapsed, the federal government responded with the Agricultural Adjustment Act, paying landowners to reduce acreage and stabilize prices. The law required that a portion of those federal payments be shared with sharecroppers. The Bootheel landlords refused. Some evicted their tenant families entirely rather than comply, replacing them with day-wage laborers who had no claim on the federal payments. The families who had worked the land for decades were displaced to make room for a more convenient labor arrangement and a larger share of a government check. This is what drove Reverend Owen Whitfield and more than 1,500 men, women, and children to the sides of Highway 60 and 61 in January 1939, one of the most consequential and least remembered protests in Missouri history. A black and white coalition camped on a state highway demanding that the land they had made productive be required to share at least a fraction of what it owed them. Subscribe before you go further. Hit the button and the bell. On the first day of 1939, more than 1,500 men, women, and children, black and white sharecroppers, piled their belongings onto the shoulders of Highways 60 and 61 in the Missouri Bootheel and refused to move. They were there because landlords in Dunklin, New Madrid, Pemiscot, and Butler counties had been evicting tenant families rather than comply with a New Deal requirement that a portion of Federal Agricultural Adjustment Act payments be shared with the sharecroppers who worked the land. The government was paying farmers to reduce crop production to raise prices. Some landowners took the federal money, evicted the tenants whose labor had made the land valuable, and converted to mechanized farming with day laborers. The sharecroppers were left with nowhere to go and no income. Their spokesman, Reverend Owen Whitfield, a black preacher and union organizer, organized the roadside demonstration deliberately and publicly, inviting reporters to document what was happening. For 2 months, 1,500 Missourians lived on the side of the highway. It was one of the first integrated protests against economic injustice in American history, predating the modern civil rights movement by 15 years. The state eventually forced them off the roads on public health grounds. Federal agencies built temporary housing, the Delmo Homes communities, for the most displaced families. Whitfield eventually fled to St. Louis after receiving death threats. The demonstration drew national attention. The New York Times covered it. The Farm Security Administration sent photographers. President Roosevelt met with Whitfield, and then the attention moved on, and the Bootheel continued as it had been. Rich land, poor people, outside ownership, local powerlessness. Mechanization in the 1940s and 1950s completed what the evictions had started. The tractors and mechanical cotton pickers that spread across the Bootheel after World War II eliminated most of the labor that sharecropping had required. A region that had needed thousands of workers to grow cotton found that it needed dozens. The Great Migration that had already pulled black families out of the Deep South now accelerated through the Bootheel. Entire communities hollowed out. The population of the Bootheel counties peaked in the mid-20th century and has been declining ever since. By 1940, the Farm Security Administration was already reporting that the region was rapidly being mechanized and that farms now operated on a factory basis, employing only a few tractor drivers for most of the year. The sharecroppers who remained found seasonal work during cotton chopping and picking seasons and waited the rest of the year for the next season. Then the mechanical cotton picker eliminated the picking season too. The land did not stop producing, it became more productive with every decade. The people who had worked it left, or were displaced, or found that there was simply no economic role left for them in the region that their families had built. They moved to St. Louis, to Chicago, to Detroit, to wherever the industrial economy had worked. The Bootheel sent its people north and kept their labor's value in the fields. Missouri lost 7,433 farms between 2017 and 2022 alone, the third largest numerical farm loss of any state in the country. That loss was not evenly distributed. It was concentrated in exactly the areas where land is most productive and most attractive to large-scale operators, the flat, drainable, irrigable bottomlands of southeast Missouri, where a corporate operation can run equipment across contiguous acres without the terrain interruptions that make the Ozarks impractical for industrial-scale farming. The small and medium operations, 100 acres, 200 acres, farms that families could manage and that sustained local communities, are the ones disappearing. The large operations absorb them and grow larger. The consolidation of the agricultural processing industry makes the land consolidation at the farm level even more damaging and more complete. In the mid-1980s, Missouri had roughly 23,000 independent hog producers. Today, there are fewer than 2,600. In one generation, 90% of Missouri's independent hog producers were put out of business, not by foreign competition, not by drought, not by any act of nature, by the concentration of pork processing into 4 corporations that together control more than 70% of the American hog market. A producer in the Bootheel who grows hogs is not selling into anything resembling a competitive market. They are selling to one of a small number of buyers who can set the price and dictate the contract terms, and the producer either accepts those terms or they find a different crop. The choice between accepting bad terms and abandoning the enterprise is not really a choice. Today, 4 meat packers process 85% of all beef slaughtered in the United States. 4 companies control 66% of all hog slaughter. The farmer who raises the animals and the consumer who buys the meat at the grocery store are both losing ground in this arrangement. The farmer gets less than 15 cents of every food dollar, while the consumer pays more. The margin in between flows to the processing, distribution, and retail layers of the supply chain, almost none of which is controlled by anyone with a connection to Missouri. The Bootheel grows the food. Somewhere else processes it, brands it, distributes it, and extracts the value from it. The arrangement is structurally identical to the drainage district model from 1905. The labor and the land produce something valuable, and the value exits to wherever the capital is. Missouri's 1975 law banning corporate ownership of agricultural land was an attempt to interrupt this pattern. It banned corporations from farming or acquiring agricultural land in the state. Then the exceptions were added. Then the exceptions to the exceptions. Then, 1 week before Shuanghui, now WH Group, a Chinese firm, completed its acquisition of Smithfield Foods, the rule was changed to allow foreign entities to hold up to 1% of Missouri farmland under certain conditions. Within weeks of that change, Missouri farmland was purchased. The legislators who pushed the rule change had received significant campaign contributions from Smithfield. The law that was supposed to protect the land from the arrangement the Bootheel had been trapped in for a century was amended away when the money needed it to be. What the Bootheel looks like today is the logical endpoint of a process that began when the drainage engineers arrived in 1905. Outside capital came in, converted the land, and claimed the value. It came in as drainage investors and insurance company landholders. It came in as cotton planters from Arkansas bringing sharecroppers. It came in as mechanized agriculture eliminating the labor that the sharecropping economy had depended on. It comes in now as investment funds bidding above market rate for cropland, as meatpacking corporations setting the terms for every livestock contract, as absentee owners leasing land to operators who funnel the proceeds elsewhere. The counties of the Bootheel produce nearly a third of Missouri's agricultural income. Their residents remain among the poorest in the state. The Farm Security Administration described it in 1935 as a paradox of rich land and poor people. The paradox is not a mystery. It is a business model, and it has been running continuously with different actors in each generation for over a century. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. Drop a comment. Is what's described here what you see when you look at the Bootheel? Because the people who live there have always understood the arrangement better than anyone else. Thank you for watching. The truth doesn't shout. It waits for you to look closer.